All right. So today what we're going to do is we're going to look at creating this idea. We're going to work with Duplicate. We're going to build a fence and just work on creating kind of a round fence in a quicker way than trying to make it manually. But we're going to just go through the process of creating the whole fence, and we're going to look at the steps necessary to kind of get it to be exactly what we want. This may take a couple of videos. There's a lot of steps, but none of the steps are particularly difficult necessarily. So the first thing I'm going to do is start off with a fence post, and I'm going to try to get it kind of pretty well centered here. Yeah, pretty well centered, and right in the middle of the origin, which is fine. Next thing I'm going to do is I want to add some fence post. So I'm going to come into edit mode, and I am going to use my edge loop cut tool, and I'm going to cut just a few loops. Now this is pretty straightforward. Now I have some faces that I can work with, and I'm just going to choose the top two of these faces in both instances, and I'm going to do an extrusion, or do an inset actually, an inset faces. Oh, I don't want to do it twice, so I'm going to do it once and inset them in. And then I'm going to press R on the keyboard, and I'm just going to scale them in. So now on both sides, you see I have pretty good edges for where I want my fence post or fence cross beams to be. So I'll hit delete on the keyboard and I'll delete the faces. Now this is interesting. I've created this kind of hole between everything, and we'll get to why we do that in a minute. But the next thing I want to do is come in and just grab the edges on just one side of my object. I don't want to grab them on the other side, right? So I'm just going to grab them here. And then just like before, I'm going to do an extrusion, and I'm going to pull these off. So now I've got kind of the generic shape of my fence that I'm looking for, right? I've got the post and I've got the two planks here going across. Now ideally I'd want another post over here. The easy way to do that is to go back into object mode, press Ctrl D on your keyboard to duplicate, and then move the other object out. And eventually you're going to get it and you're going to connect everything together. Right, but that's making a straight fence. I don't want a straight fence. I want a fence that goes around in a circle. So how do we do that? When we go to rotate this, it kind of rotates on that center pivot point, which is good, but that doesn't really help me get everything into a circle. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to come up to this tool up here where I transform the pivot point. And I'm going to pivot it around a 3D cursor here. And then I'm going to move my box, or move my fence post pretty far out. I'm going to move it 3 units out, or 3 different large boxes on my plane here. And then when I'm done with that, you'll notice that the origin, or the pivot point, is still in the center of my plane, even though my shape is way off to the side. Now this is good. This is how we're going to be able to tweak this and actually create an object that goes, or a duplication that goes around in a circle. So again, I'm going to hit Ctrl D on my keyboard to duplicate, and then I'm going to move my fence a little bit. And if you press F on your keyboard, that will actually allow you to move, to focus in on the piece that you're working on. So if you highlight both of them, then it'll focus on that. Or, F on your keyboard can help you kind of navigate around. The next thing I want to do is, I want to grab these vertexes on my initial piece, and I want to snap them, move them. Their pivot point's still a long way away, right? I want to move these pieces so that I can line them up with this object. Now that's hard to do, just because I don't know where my move tool went. It disappeared on me, which is weird. Weird. All right, so I'll pause the recording, and here's something that I just learned. If you press spacebar, it makes your widget go away that allows you to move, rotate, and scale. If you press it again, you bring it back. Learn something new every day. So what I eventually want to do is I want to get all of these vertexes over to this piece. So I'm going to hold down Shift. I'm going to select both objects. Then I'm going to go into edit mode. And we've done this before. I've selected my first point and my second point. And then I've gone into mesh and merge at last. And the problem here is that my objects are not joined. Object join, edit mode, select two vertexes, mesh, merge at last. And rinse and repeat. And rinse and repeat. And rinse and repeat. And then so forth and so on, all the way around my fence. Perfect. So now I have one post, and the second fence is not exactly what I wanted yet, but it will be. Go back into object mode. I can control duplicate again. I'm going to go into my rotation and then rotate this piece. Now, ideally you want the rotation to be exactly the same every time so that your pieces line up, right? But that's really hard to do manually, right? It's hard to get it to be at the exact rotation, the exact angle every time. When you're moving it, you do have the angle up here. So if you're very diligent, you can get it to be exact. But again, that's pretty hard to do. So what we're going to do instead is I'm going to undo back to before I joined my two objects. And by that I mean I'm going to undo back as far as I can. And I can't go back far enough, which is fine. I can just delete these. And I'm going to start over. So I'm going to add a cube. I'm going to go ahead and pause the video here until I have my fence built. Alright, I think I made this one a little bit bigger than the last one, but the principle is the same. I have my fence. I've moved the pivot point so that the pivot's in the center so that I can rotate my fence around, which is pretty cool. Now, what I did before was I duplicated the fence by pressing Control D, and then I rotated the second fence in place. And that's pretty good. That gives me a second fence. But getting through and rotating every fence to the exact same angle that I rotated that one is just going to be really tough. So what I can do is I can select the first fence, and I am going to add a modifier to it. And with this modifier, I am going to select Array. And once I select Array, you see it automatically starts trying to duplicate my fence. And I can make a whole bunch of them, or I can make just a couple. But it's a really quick way to get very exact duplicates. However, instead of relative offset, I'm going to choose object offset. And then I'm going to choose my object here, cube 001. And now I'm going to increase my count up And eventually I get 16 different fences that I can work with. I'm going to come back and delete. Whoops. I want to delete one of them. It won't let me right now. Oh, fancy. All right, I don't need to delete it. So now that I have all these fences in place, it looks like there's 2 there, but we'll deal with that in a minute. Now that I have all these fences in place, I could easily come in and object mode, object join. And then if I do edit mode, go to vertexes, grab this vertex, and as I move it into place, and I changed my pivot point again to be a bounding box center based on my selection. That just gives me a little bit more control over it. And as I get all the points in place, you can see that everything starts to come together exactly where it's supposed to be. I can do the same thing for these pieces, which I will. Just go ahead and bring them down. I'm not going to spend a lot of time getting them to be exact, but I did miss one. Close enough for now. All right, so with all of those pieces in place, and come back to object mode. And I can't delete the one that I used as an example. It's just because I used it as an example. So what I would have to do is come back and modify that in some other way. Maybe I could go into edit mode and face mode, delete all the faces. And now that object's no longer in the way, and I have this cool fence. Now the fence isn't exact because I do have this edge over here. If I wanted to, I would have to go through and do math to figure out exactly how far to rotate that first fence, which I could do. You know, if I rotated it, not 90 degrees, not 45, 22 and a half, 11 and a quarter, then I could end up with an equal number of fences all the way around, and they would line up where they were supposed to. But for the most part, that's the modifier, the tool that I wanted to discuss was the duplicate tool. Oops. Object mode, select it, space. There we go. The duplicate tool, and also looking at the pivot tool. By default, your pivot's going to be in the middle. If you're on the 3D cursor and you move your object, that's affecting how your pivot point interacts with your object. If you want the pivot point directly on the object, then you go back to bounding box center. There are other options, but these are the ones primarily that we're going to use. So that's the first video. That's our duplication. We will have a project that uses that in some way, uses the array feature. There's fixed count, there's fit length, there's fit curve. You have a lot of different options, but eventually they all come together, and that's kind of the goal of your array tool. You can do a relative offset. If you're building a brick wall, that's something that you would do. But we'll look at that maybe in the next video, and as we look at some other features that we want to talk about this week. So that's duplication, using the array modifier, the pivot point, and just kind of the basic construction structure of building a fence. And we'll see you in the next video.